All right. I have so much I want to talk about today. I'm like kind of excited, a little scattered. Um, we'll see how much we get through. There's just a bunch of little interesting things have happened, and um, but one thing I want to start out by saying, because it's a big deal, is the stuff going on in the Middle East, and I just want to make sure that we're thinking about that, and if we're capable, if we're feeling strong enough, like bringing that onto the path with us, as a way of both waking up to our wisdom and our compassion. And I had a student ask me this week about like, I don't know what I summed the question up. It was kind of like about the relativity of karma, like how can karma be true if like in one situation something's good and in another situation it's bad? So how does that work? And I had to really get down to the Buddhist basics. And I want to actually let me share my screen here real quick because I want to talk about, just jump back to the Four Noble Truths real quick as the basis of what we're talking about today. Let me find my screen. Okay, we're already all the way at the end. Just a moment. All right. So where I jumped with him was with what the Buddha was seeking. I mean, I think most people here are familiar with the life story of the Buddha. He was seeking the end of suffering. He even said, like, I talk about suffering and the end of suffering. And so we often need to come back to that, I think. It's amazing how these fundamental teachings, in a way, are all we need. But like in my experience, I have to just keep coming back to them because I overcomplicate them or I try to find workarounds. And it's just, I have to keep returning to these basic ideas. So the Buddha sought the end of suffering. Suffering, the word we're translating here is dukkha, which actually means dissatisfactoriness or discomfort, unease. And and so the question really is, why do we suffer? And the way the Buddha explained that was the Four Noble Truths. So, in brief, he said the first thing, which is really pretty radical, which is that suffering is a part of life. And on a way, that seems like no duh, but it's also like we don't normally think it's okay to encounter pain, and we react to discomfort and pain and disease as if like some major injustice has occurred. And so I think that first noble truth is one I have to come back to often just to remember, like the Buddha said, this is like part of what we're working with here. And so he said, suffering is a part of life. He said, suffering has a cause, that cause being attachment or clinging, particularly to our self concept. He talked about the cessation of suffering, the end of suffering, because if we can remove the cause of suffering, we can achieve the cessation of suffering. And he said that there's a path to achieve the cessation of suffering. And he furthermore said, what we need to do with suffering, with discomfort, is understand it. What needs to be done is it needs to be understood. And he said that we need to abandon its cause, the cause of suffering. And we need to achieve the end of suffering and rely upon the path. And in fact, he was really specific and said that other than suffering, there's nothing to understand, nothing to figure out other than suffering. Other than the cause of suffering, there's nothing to be abandoned. And other than the end of suffering, there's nothing to be achieved. And other than the path, there's nothing to rely upon. And I like to highlight here this understand and abandon combo in the front, because usually what's happening is that we're kind of one off. Like the abandon happens with the suffering. And because we're trying to abandon the suffering, we don't address the cause and we don't get to understand the suffering because we're immediately trying to get rid of it with distraction or any other thing. So we end up not actually doing the very first thing the Buddha said, which is understand suffering. So, one last little visualization of this is noting the pairs here, how we have The first two noble truths are like a cause and result. So there's the cause of suffering and its result, suffering. So attachment, clinging is the cause of suffering. It results in suffering. And the last two, the path is the cause of the end of suffering. And in any given moment, we are experiencing the results of previous actions, but we also have this rich moment in which we can create the cause of awakening right in that moment or further suffering. And we know how we need to do it because the cause of suffering is attachment. So if we're reacting to that result with more attachment to the self, we end up causing more suffering. And if we can react with curiosity and compassion, wisdom and compassion, skillful means and compassion, however you want to look at it, or skillful means and an understanding of the true nature of things, we can actually create the cause of suffering in the moment. So all of that to say that it isn't really a matter of like what's good or what's bad, who's right or who's wrong. And I found this really good quote this week that I want to let marinate for a moment. This is Sharon Salzberg. She said, if you are filled with judgment or condemnation for yourself or others, you revise your perceptions to see the world in terms of suffering and the end of suffering instead of good and bad. To see the world in terms of suffering and the end of suffering is Buddha mind and will lead us away from righteousness and anger. Get in touch with your own Buddha mind, and you will uncover a healing force of compassion. So again, if we're getting hung up on who's right or who's wrong, or what's righteous or what's not, we're missing the point. You know, this is about finding an end for suffering and making all of our actions in service of that. And if we're trying to understand or figure it out, what we should be trying to understand is suffering. And what we should be trying to abandon is its causes. And we should be doing our best to help other people do that too, or at least not making a way for them to indulge behaviors that are not helpful to themselves or other people. So that's my take on it. And with that in mind, let's say the 4-line refuge prayer. And we can, in this moment, generate bodhicitta, the mind of awakening. Bodhi is the same root as Bud, which means to awake, to be awake. So we want to generate this mind of awakening. It's the mind that sees the world in terms of suffering and the end of suffering, and therefore naturally radiates loving kindness and compassion. And we can also say this prayer with the aspiration to attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. But we can also especially say it to be able to pacify hatred and aggression that are plaguing our world right now. So with that in mind, let's say the refuge prayer once in Tibetan, once in English, and once in Tibetan. O Sangye Chidang Sukhi Chodnama Janchu Padu Dagni Kyapsuchi Daki Jinsu Ki Pe Sunam Ki Rola Penchir Sangye Druparsho. I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha until I reach enlightenment. By the merit of accomplishing generosity, O Sangye Chidang Sukhi Chodnam Janchu Padu Dakni Kyapsuchi Daki Jinso Ki Pe Sunam Ki Jola Penchi Sangye Druparsho. Now I'll say a short prayer of my own. Agi chimu bededen junan kajin jimbo goneje zunzen usun tuking jub sadu so. Okay, let's do a short practice together. We'll take a posture that is not too tight, not too loose, balanced, tuned. And I like to start with what I think is a kind of the most basic mindfulness that we can practice in a healthful way, which is just seeing how we feel. So just take a couple moments to try to notice where you're landing on a spectrum from dull to agitated. This is a simple practice to do at any time during the day. I think it's especially advisable before you decide to take on something that may be a little more work than you're used to. And I think it's good to remember that when you notice how you're doing on that spectrum, balanced is and what we're always shooting for, but we're rarely there. And if we are, it's not for long. So it's okay to not be perfectly balanced, but we should be aware when we're getting towards the ends of that spectrum, out to the extremes. Because if we're particularly spaced out or particularly agitated, it may not be a good time to challenge ourselves or push ourselves. That may be a time where we need to resource and we need to find things that can bring us back towards some balance. And that's the gist of what we've been talking about and what we'll be talking about today. So, keeping in mind where you are on that scale, um, remember that you're always welcome to shift your posture or do your own practice or engage in whatever self care you need when you find yourself outside your window. With that in mind, let's take just a moment to place our attention on the breath. In particular, I'm going to suggest that you put your attention on the motion of your chest as it moves up and down. And if that anchor doesn't work for you, you can try where your body meets the seat, the sense of gravity or weight. We're using the breath or that sense of weight as an anchor for our mindfulness, an anchor for our attention. So when you notice you get distracted, just gently bring your attention back. It's actually a good thing to notice distraction. And now let's drop the technique and just be here for a minute. We're just going to observe, nothing to do. Again, if we notice ourselves getting distracted or pulled away, we just gently come back. But what we're coming back to here is just an open awareness, just being. As we do this, we'll notice sensations in our body, we'll notice things in our environment, we'll have thoughts, maybe images that come into our mind. All of that's allowed. But if we notice we start to follow it into concepts or stories, again, we just return to being and observing. And then to close, let's come back to whatever anchor we were working with before. And we can begin to shift in our seats now as we begin to transition out of this meditation. So I think that one interesting thing about that, doing those two practices, which are actually one practice done two different ways, is that there's a common piece, which is letting go, non-attachment. So it's easier to have an object, something to put our attention on. But at the end of the day, in both cases, we're letting go. It's a little harder, like I said, when you've got no object. It's just a more difficult practice, I think. But some people find it vice versa. Some people find the opposite to be true. So, but in either case, we're doing the same thing. And top or the I said top three things. The three things are maybe they are the top three things today. Are curiosity, compassion, and improvisation are the three kind of themes I want to deal with today. And we can see these even arising in a practice like that. When and actually I'll tell this story now. Another cool thing that happened to me this week is we have string quartet in residence that comes to Denison twice a year, and they are really interesting group. They're called Ethel, Ethel, and they do a lot of improvisation and a lot of really cool collaborations. And a couple of them are mindfulness practitioners in one way or another. And they came to one of our professor's mindfulness classes. And this mindfulness professor invited me to come and lead that class that they were at. And I actually have a music degree. That was what I went to college for. So I was able to give them pretty clear instructions on what I wanted them to do in the language, you know. Um, and I did it based on something I would love to do sometime with your center as well. I need to figure out a way to pipe sounds into Zoom, and then we can do it. But I have done several times a meditation using sound clips, and I wanted to kind of mimic that, but with the live music. So we did 4 separate sessions, like mindfulness sessions, using the musicians as the anchor. And the first time I asked them to play predictable rhythms with consonant harmonies. So I said a little bit more than that, but I wanted them to start out steady on one note and slowly go to different notes, but pleasing harmonies. And then the rhythms were all steady and predictable. And then we did that for about 5 minutes, and it was beautiful. I mean, I gave them like very simple instructions, and these incredible musicians made beautiful pieces of music for these 10 students who were practicing meditation. It was great. Um, and so one thing we talked about after that first session was curiosity, and this idea that when things seem static or they seem repetitive, um, we might need to apply more curiosity. That when we meet with things that seem repetitive or static, our tendency may be to turn away from curiosity and kind of check out. So, in the face of repetitiveness or seemingly static situations, it's advisable to pique the curiosity a little bit. In the second session, I had them do a little bit more dissonant harmonies and a little bit more unpredictable rhythms. And that gets harder. When I do this with sounds, when I do it with sound clips, I always start with like rain, just heavy rain. So it's almost just like white noise. And then we'll go to like a little bit less heavy rain. So the drip drops are not as steady. And then when we get to waves, if you can imagine, trying to use a wave as your anchor in meditation, it's a little more tricky because it's not always there, and it's rolling in and getting louder and getting softer, and it gets a lot harder when things are not steady. And so I think when things become unpredictable, and especially when things become a little more emotive or emotional, like with dissonant harmonies and things like that, things that aren't just naturally pleasant, or are the extremes of emotion. Those are cases where I think compassion can be a little more helpful. So when emotions get high, often our compassion suffers, and that's, like I said, either direction. I think it's probably most helpfully applied when it's a negative emotions we're encountering, but it happens when we get super excited and happy too. We then become very protective of our own situation, and not want that to change. So compassion can be very helpful for other people, but again, also for us too. So another piece of this compassion, like with the meditations we were just doing, is the gentleness and openness with things not going exactly the way we wanted them to go. So when we try to predict situations or find things that fit our needs, they don't always end up that way. And we sometimes react with ignorance or attachment or aversion. And those 3 things that we call the 3 poisons are not ideal, but we've been practicing that. I use the word practicing, but we've been habituated in that way for a very, very long time. So um, it's not the kind of thing where we ought to beat ourselves up too much. And I think to jump back to the suffering situation and understanding suffering, one of the most easy ways, I think, to start to cut down on the suffering in our lives is to really notice when we're causing it on top of the thing that is also unfortunate. If something happens, it's not what we expect, it's not what we like, that's kind of its own bit of pain. Like we can also just meet that with curiosity and compassion and improvisation and move on. But so often we then start to get into what is almost like an attachment to a reality that never existed and doesn't exist right now. Like we get attached to like the situation where we're not in discomfort, where the thing that was unfortunate didn't happen. And that's just not what happened. And so often that's the cause of at least a significant chunk of our suffering. Like we've opted into that in a way. It's not the easiest, again, to break those habits, but compassion. So all of these, it's not like a grab one and leave the rest behind. Like these work together to make a balanced system, I think. And I also think there's a connection here between the three vehicles too. I mean, I think we can make a case for curiosity being one of the hallmarks of the Hinayana, and examining interdependence, things like that. Compassion, obviously, being Mahayana, and improvisation being like the Vajrayana tantric approach. So I think that case can be made. But yeah, so these three, I think, are something that have been on my mind a lot lately. And I was going to review what we talked about last time, but we don't have a ton of time today. So I'm going to skip what we did last time. I'd like to jump to another brief practice we can do together. But before then, any comments or questions about any of this we've talked about so far? Okay, we'll talk more later too. So I want to ask, or I want to invite everyone to do a little bit different kind of a practice now. This series is called Resilience and Resourcing on the Buddhist Path, and it's something I've been working with a lot, and it's something in the people I work with that I've encountered that a lot of people need, especially right now. So this, in some ways, can seem to be counter to teachings we may have received, especially when we think about this idea of not being attached to the self, but then resourcing and getting things we need, or taking care, like this self-care run counter to non-attachment, is kind of maybe one way to think about this. Uh, and that's something to contemplate for sure. And that's something we can discuss later. But I think the first thing that comes to my mind when I think of that is I don't think I could do any of this if I couldn't do some self-care too. So I think we have to hold both ultimate and relative truth. We have to hold this situation of an understanding of ultimate truth, but also we have to hold and honor our relative situation right now. And to me, that is the path, really, in a nutshell. So with that in mind, let's take a posture again that's not too tight, not too loose. We're going to keep our eyes open and our body's loose too. And the invitation now is to look around your room. Part of this resilience and resourcing is really about embodied practice, bringing our practice into everyday normal things we do in ways that are actually helpful in the moment. So I'm going to ask you now to just look around your room, look at specific objects while you look, take a moment, but practice with detachment. Practice like you would be practicing shamatha, meaning if you start to think about the objects, just come back to observing. But I want you to definitely look at things, look around. Again, when you notice you're thinking about the thing or it's evoking some sort of emotion or plan for you, just try to return to just observing. Okay. Now that's an important foundational skill. I mean, this is in a way embodied shamatha. We're just practicing non-attachment, but we're doing it with what we see in our environment. And this is something we can do anytime in any situation we're in. But I say it's an important foundational skill because it's not like the completion of the path. There's more to be done here. And that type of a practice is challenging. I mean, one of the reasons it's challenging is because we're so used to doing things. We're so used to thinking about stuff. We're so used to making the connections and wondering, like for instance, why haven't I read? I was going to say that book, but why haven't I read all of those books over there that I bought in order to read? Right. So that's a thing I might start to think about, or I could just look at them and notice the thought about it and just observe. So it's an important skill, but it's not easy because that's not most of what we do during the day, especially when we're interacting with other people or doing our jobs or things like that. So that's a piece. It's the piece of the story. It's the most important foundational skill with meditation. But yeah, uh, Tara or Tara, how do you prefer?
Doesn't matter. So I was reading Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche's Lojong Shenpa Shedrel text earlier today,
Mm-hmm.
and he's talking about parting from the four attachments. And one of the things he was saying is that, if you're sitting there and, you feel anger coming up or whatever it is, he said that even labeling it consisted of grasping. So
Mm,
I'm thinking, okay, so usually what I do if I start feeling something, I usually try and identify, well, what am I feeling and what's the source of this emotion? And I want to examine it. But he's saying that even just labeling it is grasping, and that you should just let the sensation or the thought or the emotion arise and let it self liberate without even labeling it or identifying it or basically interacting with it in any way. Could you talk about that?
yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I can't comment on that specific teaching or text because I have not read it. But I think my first thing would be to say that I think when we're doing a practice, and maybe you can tell me if this is the case or not, if he was talking about doing a practice, there may be specific ways of doing that that aren't necessarily the blanket rule all the time. So if he's talking about in the context of a practice, that may be that may be what he's kind of saying is if you're doing this.
Well, what he was when the way he was talking about it, there's like four points. They're parting from the four attachments, and he was talking about the fourth one. And so I guess, one of the attachments is grasping onto thoughts,
Mm,
emotions, concepts, whatever, and that you shouldn't even label it. Don't even, focus enough on it
yeah,
to label it. And so I was kind of curious about that.
I'll tell you how I take all of those teachings. I take all of those teachings as being the perfect way of doing it. And how can I do it? It becomes like the second question, how and when? Meaning, like, is this a situation where have the resources to not do a little bit of grasping? So I guess what I'm trying to say here is balance. Like I think there's balance involved in, and to be entirely frank, like part of the reason why I'm doing this talk is I've had like I think a lot of people involved in organized religion, I've encountered a lot of fundamentalism around things that the practices that we do, and I've seen people struggle with that, and maybe not have the best experience because, and I'm not saying it's anyone's fault or any teacher's fault, it's how we take these things. Like I think we need to be open both to the idea of our ever-present innate Buddhahood and this experience of being fallible and not as strong as we would like at certain times and needing comfort. So I think that there's a lot of teachings in Buddhism. And then we also have to think about like the vehicle that we're maybe talking about at that point, because things in the Vajrayana get real different. I mean, like things that we might say in the Hinayana become a whole different story when we're talking about it through a Vajrayana lens. So does that help?
Well, I think for me, it's more helpful for me to even be able to identify what I'm feeling and
Yeah.
look at that and see, where is it coming from and what exactly am I feeling? And so then to me, if I can look at it and say, oh, that's anger, then I can release it, you
Hmm.
know? So it's helpful for me to be able to identify what's going on. Uh, so maybe I'm just not at that level.
Well, I got to
That's
be honest.
probably more advanced than I'm prepared
In
to
a lot of
do.
cases, I'm with you though. I mean, in a lot of cases, I'm with you for sure. So I think, yeah, I don't know what more I can say about that, but I think maybe what we're doing next may help inform it.
Okay.
So let's see. Let's come back. We can circle back. But so I want to try a little something different. So we just did look around the room with detachment. Now I want to do something different. I want to invite you again to be present and look around your room. But this time I want you to look at specific things and I want you to notice how they make you feel. And in particular, what I mean is there's no need to get into why they make you feel a certain way or the story of how they make you feel a certain way. Just notice what we call like the feeling tones that they evoke. So, for instance, do they feel pleasant? Do they feel unpleasant? Or do they feel neutral? What is coming up in you with specific objects you look at? So just take a scan of the room and try some different objects and see if you can just notice that feeling tone. And now I want you to find something, maybe it's something you already found. Find something that makes you feel good. Something that when you look at it, or maybe even hold it, if it's something you can touch and hold, I would actually encourage that right now. If it's something you can even get up and grab and put it in your hands, I would say to do that. And see if you can just put your attention on whatever's changed in your body, whatever sensory differences you're noticing as you feel pleasant or good. And this part's a little trickier. I want to encourage you to try to consider why this object is evoking the positive feelings it is in you. Could be the shape, the color, the texture, could be where it came from or what it signifies. So we're starting to get back into the conceptual aspect here even more. And the practice here that I really want to offer as a way of using the attention you've developed in your meditation for resourcing is, as you contemplate why, you may notice that things come to mind that don't feel positive. They may be comparisons with other times or situations when you didn't have those things, or it may make you think about a habit you want to get rid of. And I want to just take a couple minutes to see if you can place the attention on the good feelings. And when you notice the things you're thinking leading you towards feelings that aren't as nice, see if you can redirect your attention back to what feels positive, even if it's just returning to looking at the object or holding it. But be tuned in to what's happening in your body. Okay. So, as practitioners, we don't have to always detach. But I think I can say, just from personal experience, I got a little hung up on the detaching. And I think that a lot of people, that happens to them. Like, I think maybe we get a little bit too much on the side of we start with shamatha. Most of us have done shamatha for the longest amount of time. And I think that we can kind of train ourselves to always detach and just observe. And that means we may not be actually taking in some of the good things in life, or the things that can actually give us the resources and the strength to continue and persist on the path. And we can be more awake to what makes us feel good and why. And we can be more awake to what doesn't make us feel good and why. I mean, that's in one sense connecting to karma, connecting to our karma and really examining it. And the why here is important because it can help us to find transferable resources, transferable vulnerabilities. We can start to see what are the things across multiple situations that can make me feel good, or in many situations. Or another way to say it would be not contingent upon situations. So I can tell you, for instance, I've been carrying around a little rock with me lately. I actually have a bunch of these here because I like little smooth rocks. I always have, but I'd kind of forgotten this until recently. And I remembered how much I like just holding a smooth rock and rubbing it with my thumb. It's really nice, you know. And we can talk about this, but I mean, is that attachment? You know, is that attachment that I like, you know, having something, you know, in my hand to rub? I mean, that's one question, but more information. I also know I won't always have this with me. So I also tune into how it feels when I have the rock. And so that wherever I go, I can bring to mind not even just the rock and like even pretending I'm rubbing it, but also just like recall the feeling. And even just recalling the positive feeling can bring it back, not contingent on external circumstances. So um, we kind of begin a good creative practice of shamatha usually involves finding more and more anchors of mindfulness, finding more and more things where we can place our attention with detachment, and or just have like an open awareness, you know, of everything with detachment and equanimity. But what I'm talking about here is finding anchors really of nourishment, like finding the things where we can anchor our strength and anchor our self-compassion, and things that will give us the drive to be curious, and the drive to be compassionate, and the drive to improvise. I mean, these things are essential on the path. And I mean, part of what we're working with, particularly in the Vajrayana, is bringing everything to the path. And that's part of the reason why the Mahasiddhas are such a big part of this whole story. They're seemingly wild beings who do things that we wouldn't normally expect beings to do. But there's so many ways to enlightenment. And we aren't Mahasiddhas, but at the same time, we have our own situation, and our situation requires um, comforting ourselves sometimes and doing the things we need so that we can get back into a balance where we can push on further. And if you haven't seen the previous two talks, I summarized the first talk in the last talk I gave here, so the one right before this. And I would definitely recommend visiting that material, because I think that does really give a good foundation for what we talked about today. But one funny story I wanted to tell from retreat that came to mind about this is many of you may have been at soak feast practices uh, at the monastery or at your local centers. That's where we put a bunch of food out and do a big elaborate puja to bless it and consecrate it, and then we offer it, and then also enjoy some ourselves. And so there is this element of enjoyment to Tantra. And one of the things that sits on the table at those events is a skull cup of liquor. And in our 3-year retreat, myself and another guy, we have enjoyed liquors in our lives before. And there's no, obviously in 3-year retreat, there's no, like, you don't just drink in retreat. But this is part of the ceremony, this liquor, and you have some liquor. And there was a time about partway through the retreat where one of the guys went up to have seconds. And one of the teachers was like, no, we don't do that. No, that's not what that's for, you know? And some of us argued that point. Like, I kind of think that is what it's for. And we asked Rinpoche, I mean, when I say seconds, I meant another spoonful. We're not like down in classes, but we asked Rinpoche, you know, like, what's that for? You know, and he said, that's to enjoy. That's liquor to enjoy as part of the feast. So, I mean, I think that that's not the only example I think that stands behind these things, but we have to be able to engage in things that are pleasurable for us, but still be able to work with this idea of non-attachment. So yes, I think it's important to have these anchors of nourishment in our lives too. But it's also another avenue where we have to be able to work with non-attachment, because we may not always be able to access those same resources in the same situations, in which case, again, improvising, like we have to in some way be able to improvise a solution to the situation. I think I dropped the story of the Ethel string quartet halfway through it, because I did curiosity and compassion, and then the third session they did pure improvisation. It was just and I asked them for chaos, and they gave me pure chaos, and it was beautiful. And in the fourth time they did a beautiful Irish piece, composed like modern classical piece. But the reason I just remember to jump back to that now is because there were such good questions from the class. Like, the first student asked, is that composed or is that improvised? And the musicians had amazing things to say about mindfulness and improvisation. And I mean, I don't know if any of you have ever considered, like, can one be mindful while you play music? You know, which is a very complex thing, and all kinds of different things happening at the same time, and emotions, and, you know, humor. There's all kinds of things in music, right? And so it's a really interesting conversation, I think, to examine, can one play mindful music, or even like, or to say it as like, can you be fully mindful when you're playing music, or with your attention completely open? But really, I think what you always come back to is it's some kind of balance. Like, there's a level where we're past the seeming duality and it's just happening. And really, I think music or improvisation of any kind is embodied practice. That's it. Like, embodied mindfulness, embodied awakening is the state that is curious and compassionate, and acting based entirely upon what's coming up in the situation. And that's what those musicians did. And the students were incredibly intrigued and impressed. And so these are, I guess, just to put it in personal terms, these are the things that I'm working with nowadays. Are curiosity, compassion, and improvisation are the ways I'm working like right now, or looking at my practice and my embodiment of that practice in daily life. So, Tara, does that inform your question a little bit? Did that hit with a little more context, maybe?
Yeah, that was good.
Good, good, good. Thoughts or questions from anyone else?
Just a wee comment.
Mhm.
When you were talking about self-care earlier, in the early part of your presentation, and if I remember correctly, you said, well, self-care could be considered perhaps attachment. But I was listening to a Lama Kathy recording earlier today, and she was talking about the basics of Buddhism. It was sort of an introductory lecture, but she said, one of the things she said is, do no harm whatsoever. And she briefly mentioned intention, but I also thought, well, but you also have to be not doing harm through negligence. So in a way, the self-care thing is not, you can say it's not attachment to the extent that you are dealing with taking care of yourself to the extent that you need to be taken care of. Otherwise, you are, through negligence, creating some sort of harm.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think that's well said. Yeah.
anyway.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah, because I think that, I mean, a lot of this is arising from the fact that I just see a whole lot of people getting hung up on like doing things perfectly or right, or the good way, um, all the time. And I see that causes a lot of people probably more suffering and obstacles than they need. And I think that we can be awake and be compassionate, and be Buddha, doing things with joy. And I think that is, like Bruce had mentioned, like it would be negligent not to sometimes. Like we need to do those things.
Mm-hmm. There you are.
Thank you. How was that practice of looking at stuff, the first session, like shamatha of just looking around your room? Has anyone done that sort of a practice in daily life ever? It's a good one. It's a good one.
I have not done that before. However, I noticed, wow, how much discursive thoughts I have when I just look at some object. It's, man.
And like when you started meditating, it's like that's been there. We just haven't been noticing.
Oh.
And so, especially with all our stuff, like that old George Carlin routine about stuff, and it's like we all just collect our stuff. I don't think he used the word stuff, but yeah, like we have houses full of these little anchors for feeling tones of positive, negative, or neutral. And sometimes just even becoming aware of that can be really helpful, because one thing I've done since I started working with this stuff is like, there's things I don't want in my house anymore. There's no need for them. They don't make me feel good.
I didn't notice anything that made me feel actively bad, because if it made me feel actively bad, I would have gotten rid of it by now. But there was a fair number of things that had mixed positive and negative associations with, or sad, sad, like, pictures of my deceased pets, and, various other things that have mixed happy and sad feelings associated with them.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that too, because I want to, I maybe I haven't said this clearly enough, but I want to again come back to suffering and the end of suffering. So, and we're really talking about a practice of resourcing here. So there may be situations where something that is a little sad is actually resourcing for us. So I wanted to tie that back to what we talked about in the beginning, suffering and the end of suffering versus good and bad, or positive and negative. Like we can examine what is causing suffering for us in the moment and what is not, and that doesn't necessarily have to feel good or bad,
Yeah,
but it's good to know. Go ahead.
oh, I was going to say it just is like when that arises, whatever that is brought up, there it is. And some of it makes us feel good, and some of us makes us, as you just said, makes us unhappy. And why not look at that? Either way.
Why not look at it, you said?
I mean, it's meaningful to look at it.
Yeah, and if it's so another way to say it is it serving what we need in the moment? Is it giving us, if we need resource? So we worked kind of broadly, we worked with like a shamatha based practice, and we worked with like a cognitive practice, like really getting back involved with concepts. And in a certain moment, we may feel like, you know what, I'm feeling pretty good. I'm going to do that shamatha practice in my life today. And I'm just going to watch and observe and detach and all those things. But at some point, if we're checking in with how we're feeling and we notice getting towards the extremes of that spectrum, we may think at that point, you know what, I need to take a little care of myself. I'm going to, with an awake and curious and compassionate mind, I'm going to look around my space and find something that helps me, or I'm going to bring to mind a memory or a feeling that is resourcing for me. And in that, so really it's about, in the moment, are we doing what serves the path ultimately? Because progressing on the path means, challenging ourselves when we're strong, and resourcing when we need resourcing.
That makes so much sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I've been looking around my space because a friend of mine is like the Mother Teresa of dog rescue. And she found a puppy bleeding out in the street that had just been hit by a car. And the poor baby had a fractured skull and had to have surgery and has been in the hospital. So, she has been looking for a foster for it because he gets out tomorrow. And she asked me, and I absolutely couldn't say no. And I had decided I was very happy. Just my dog died a couple of months ago. And I thought, okay, I'm okay, just me and my cat. And she's okay. Like, you can tell when an animal needs a companion and when they're content with just you, kind of thing. But there was no way I could say no. And yeah. And so, and they're putting in, of all timing, a new quote unquote balcony door in every unit. And all I can smell in the hallways, and they've been doing it floor by floor, is glue. And I just hear drilling all day. And they came in here, and so did the manager. And the notice just said, get anything delicate off your balcony. Well, today they're like, you have to take everything off your balcony. You have to remove a bookcase that's inside so we can access your balcony. I said, like, that's impossible. It's a 7-foot bookcase loaded with, where am I putting it?
Yeah.
And so it was just all such a nightmare. And there isn't a solution as yet, except that my neighbor said he noticed them using a pulley to take one up from street level. And I had even asked them because his balcony, we share the same fence or whatever you want to call that, and he has nothing on his balcony. I said, can't they in through his balcony, hand it, you have 5 guys. 2 can carry it into his place, hand it to you on my balcony, and done. And they're like, oh, we're not allowed to do that. So I don't, none of it's making sense. And so then
I'm sorry you went through that.
And I'm just worried about this little puppy because he couldn't stand or walk or anything, and now he is standing up, and he has a healthy appetite, and he's eating. I mean, his whole jaw was broken, his skull. 9
Could you
months.
tell us his name so we could pray for him?
Thank you for asking. Rocky.
Rocky?
Yes.
Rocky. We'll keep Rocky in mind, and you as well.
Thank you. And
Oh,
Vasadar.
you're welcome.
Friend said, because my cat loves dogs. Oh, so the bottom line was when he came in here and my cat is sniffing his shoes, I said, you have a dog, don't you? He said, yes. I said, oh, well, she loves dogs. He said, do you have a dog? I said, oh, you'll meet my dog tomorrow. Because he knew, and I didn't want to go through my dog died, and I didn't want to but you didn't notify us, and you have to give you approval and all that stuff. So yeah, it's very bureaucratic around here. But anyway,
well, we'll keep you in the dog in our prayers for sure.
Which makes me look like my space a whole other way because he's got to be in a pen, and I'm in a postage stamp size apartment, and yeah, and it's going to be really challenging, like making space, because my cat and I have much space we walk around things.
Yeah.
So,
one thing that brings to mind for me as another means to that I find resourcing is recalling comfortable cats sleeping or dogs like comfortably snoring. That always makes me feel a little better, Tara?
Moving and normalizing. What I love about dogs and all animals, really, no matter what is going on, they never ever lose their essential nature. We do. We're like one fine line from sanity to over the edge nervous breakdown, but not them.
I think it probably has something to do with the level of conceptuality that we can dip into being different. Yeah.
Chadu Tuku, he was a disciple of Dujin Rinpoche, Nyingma Lama, and he knew he was dying, but we didn't. And he came and gave like 5 days in a row of empowerments, like everything he had. And he had a Pekingese, and he had prayed the entire dog's life for its nature to change because it would bite everyone. It was just a vicious little dog. And I had my Pekingese, who was the sweetest thing, in my arms. And he could barely walk. He had an attendant on each arm, not because he was sick, but because he had been imprisoned, and captured by the Chinese. Anyway, he didn't even look at any student. He just was quelling over this little dog, right? Oh, she has the sweetest nature, nature. And when we got back from lunch, he got up and we're all standing in the aisle. When he got back from lunch, he said, I want to tell everyone something. You humans are crazy. He said, animals know who loves them, who's sincere, and who isn't, because they think with their hearts. you guys are in your heads that you, pardon my French, but you use these words, that you mind fuck yourselves in and out of love. You don't know what's genuine, even your own feelings. And I like to think
Yeah.
my little Pekingese Ashley Mae West inspired that talk. But I
Oh, that's neat.
think of that because it's so true about our minds.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah. I think Daniel's got a question, and I think Tara's hand was up first.
Oh, no, I just wanted to ask for your prayers for my mother who passed away on October 10th. Sorry, October 8th,
Oh, I'm sorry to hear.
Dorothy McAfee.
And I'd like to ask for your prayers for a friend of mine, Deborah D'Amato, who had cancer, breast cancer in remission, and now there's something potentially suspect. And so add her to the prayer list.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then Summers, who wrote a book about health. She was such a champion of medicine and had with cancer in remission forever, and also really help people understand toxic mold. The book is called Sick. It's a great book, by the way. She died Sunday of breast cancer.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I know.
Well, we'll keep Dorothy McAfee. That was your mom's name? Yeah. Deborah D'Amato, Rocky, Suzanne Summers. Daniel?
I was just thinking about what Kira said about that we don't know love, and I'm hearing over and over again in some of the teachings I'm listening to that if we're going to attain awakening, we need to have renunciation, bodhicitta, so that's where the love comes in, non-referential love, and the view. And if one of those three are missing, we're not going to be Buddhas.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
Renunciation, bodhicitta, the view, and what was the fourth thing, Daniel?
Just those three things: renouncing samsara, having bodhicitta, and knowing the view.
Yeah, the way I heard it was renunciation, bodhicitta, shunyata. It's a little bit easier to remember that way.
Yeah.
Wow.
I'm not an alcoholic. Attended a Guru Rinpoche and Soak and a Sir. So
Awesome.
yeah,
Neat.
I had to drink with the protectors.
Yeah. Wow. Well, any other thoughts or questions before we wrap up tonight? I hope this was helpful because I know this is not necessarily traditional material we're covering, but like I said last time around, like this is to me like making the connection between our formal practice and the way we move through the world is in a lot of ways most of the work we have to do, because for most of us we don't do our formal practice all day long. And I think being able to find these ways of bridging the formal practice with our daily life, and actually making use of the awareness we're cultivating in our practice, and making use of the compassion we're cultivating, and making use of the ability to see the world as vivid and insubstantial. That stuff has to make its way out the door with us, or even just out of the shrine room into the living room or the kitchen or the office. So thank you
Yeah.
all. I'm going to I had one. No, we'll share that one next time.
No, there now.
I'm going to throw this one on next time because I think it'll go with what we're doing next time. But yeah, so I'm going to put the dedication prayer up on the screen here. Okay, so we'll say this is the first part. We're going to do both of these complementary verses, and the first of these we can think of as being a relative dedication, and then the second is like the ultimate dedication from the perspective of the ultimate view. So we'll start here and say this together. By this merit, may all beings obtain the omniscience of Buddhahood and defeat our common enemy, wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, may we free all beings. The courageous Manjushri, who knows everything as it is. Samantabhadra, who also knows in the same way. And also all the bodhisattvas, that I may follow in their path. I completely dedicate all this virtue. And let's take just a moment to rest the mind. Okay. Thank you all. Curiosity, compassion, improvisation.
Thank you, Lama Adam.
Ew.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you again soon.